On the afternoon of October 26, 2015, a regulator in Abuja issued a press release. The number on the page was 1,040 billion naira. In US dollars, it was 5.2 billion. It was the largest regulatory fine ever levied on a single company anywhere on Earth. Within 2 weeks, MTN's share price on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange had collapsed by a quarter. The group's chief executive, a Zimbabwean engineer named Sifiso Dabengwa, had been forced to resign. And the company that had spent 21 years building Africa's largest mobile network was looking at the prospect that a single regulatory ruling in a single foreign capital could break it in half. It was, in many ways, the bill arriving for a strategy that had defined the company since the day it was born, going where the political risk was highest, because that was also where the customers were. This is the story of MTN Group. Hi again. Welcome back to the pod. My name is Farouk, and today we are going deep into the story of MTN. How a South African startup, born 5 days after Nelson Mandela was sworn in, became Africa's largest telecoms operator with 307 million subscribers across 16 countries. By making one bet again and again that nobody else wanted to make. Let's get into it. To understand MTN, you have to begin in the last months of apartheid. On the 29th of September, 1993, 7 months before South Africa's first democratic election, a brand new regulator called the Independent Broadcasting Authority awarded the country's first 2 GSM cellular licenses. One went to Vodacom, a joint venture between state-owned Telcom and the British telecoms giant Vodafone. The other went to a consortium called MCell, which would, 8 years later, change its name to the one the continent now knows, MTN. The license was a piece of paper, but the cap table behind it was a political document. 20% of the company was held by NAIL, New Africa Investments Limited, the first black-controlled group ever listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, founded by Ntato Motlana, the physician who had been Nelson Mandela's personal doctor for 30 years. 5% was held by SACWU, the Southern African Clothing and Textile Workers Union. 5% more was held by FABCOS, a black business federation. 30% of one of the most strategically important corporate licenses in the new South Africa was, by design, in black hands on day one. This was not an accident, and not a marketing line. The license had required it. The other names on the share register were just as deliberate. Transnet, the state-owned railway. Naspers, the Afrikaans Media House. Cable and Wireless of the United Kingdom, brought in for the engineering. And in the chairman's seat, an attorney and former trade unionist named Cyril Ramaphosa, who, 24 years later, would become president of South Africa. The network went live on the 1st of June, 1994. It was 5 days after Mandela had been sworn in as the first democratically elected president of the new republic. The optics were deliberate. So was the logic underneath them. In June of 1994, fewer than 1 in 100 adult black South Africans had a telephone in their home. The apartheid-era Telkom had built a copper fixed-line network that almost perfectly mirrored the racial geography of the country. Dense in the white suburbs, almost completely absent in the townships and the rural homelands. The new government didn't have the time, the money, or the political appetite to rebuild that network from scratch. But it did not have to. Wireless could leapfrog all of it. A cell tower could serve a township in months. The first call from the new South Africa's democratic majority did not need to wait for a copper line to be dug. The first CEO was a telecoms executive named John Beck. He was replaced in 1995 by Bob Chaffee, who would build the launch network. The company's own 30th anniversary history would, decades later, title the chapter on this period with admirable honesty. A lily-white company. The BEE structure on the share register, the history admits, took years to filter into the operational and management ranks. The license was black-owned at the holding company level. The engineering room, for most of the first decade, was not. And there was one more uncomfortable truth about those early years. MCell was not winning at home. Vodacom, better capitalized, better resourced, with a multinational parent, passed 1 million subscribers in 1996. Mcell would not follow until 1998. In its own home market, the company that would one day serve more Africans than any other operator was, structurally, the perpetual number 2. The question facing Mcell at the end of the 1990s was the question facing every challenger in every industry. If you cannot win at home, where can you win? The answer, when it came, was north. By the middle of the 1990s, MTN's executive team understood something the South African press was slow to write about. The opportunity for a South African telecoms operator was not South Africa. Vodacom had the home market locked down. The South African market, even fully built out, was no more than 50 million people, half of whom would never afford a phone. The fight there was a fight for the second-place ribbon. But step over the Limpopo River, and the picture changed completely. North of South Africa lay a continent of 700 million people. The fixed-line penetration was, in most of those countries, below 1%. The state telecoms monopolies were the same kind of sclerotic, apak apartak apartat kapartat akantat antat, abata adtokatat akgak ontatkak akipakpat. Institutions that South Africa had just inherited at home, and the incumbent mobile operators, where they existed at all, were small, undercapitalized, and slow. A South African operator that could move first, that knew how to build a GSM network in a market with bad power and no incumbent, and that did not need to wait for European or American boards to approve a Lagos site visit. That operator could have the entire continent. Vodacom's strategy was to grow at home. MTN's strategy would be to leave. In 1998, the same year MTN finally hit 1 million subscribers in its home market, 2 years behind its rival. The company launched commercially in Uganda. The Ugandan market in 1998 had fewer than 50,000 fixed lines for a population of more than 20 million people. Inside 18 months, MTN Uganda would have more subscribers than Uganda Telecom had ever had on copper. The thesis worked. Months later, MTN went live in Rwanda. 4 years after the genocide, a market that the rest of the global telecoms industry had written off as politically unbankable. MTN Rwandacell was, for years, one of the only meaningful foreign direct investment vehicles in the country. It built the network as the country was rebuilding itself. In the year 2000, MTN acquired and rebranded Camtel Mobile in Cameroon. Eswatini followed. The shape of the company began to change. It was no longer a Johannesburg telecoms challenger. It was becoming something Africa had never had before, a pan-African operator, built and managed from the south, expanding into markets where the South African passport was not a foreign one. And here, the unwritten rule of MTN's strategy began to show itself. MTN went into markets where political risk was high, because political risk was where the incumbents were not. It built in Uganda when most foreign capital still saw Uganda as a Museveni-era frontier. It built in Rwanda when the country's name still meant only one thing in international headlines. The premium it earned was the premium of being first. But the same logic, go where others will not, would, in the years to come, take the company into rooms it should never have entered. Sudan, during the Darfur War, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran. Every one of those licenses was a number on a balance sheet. Every one of them, 20 years later, would be a courtroom. By the year 2000, none of that was yet visible. What was visible was a South African challenger that had stopped competing with Vodacom and had instead, quietly, gone around it. The home market loser was about to bid for the prize that would define the company forever. The prize was Nigeria. In early 2001, the Nigerian Communications Commission ran an open-spectrum auction for 3 GSM licenses. The auction was, at the time, an unusual event in the global telecoms industry. Most African telecoms licenses were awarded in closed rooms, on political timetables by ministerial decree. Nigeria's NCC ran a public sealed bid process with a published reserve price. International regulators would later study it as a model. MTN bid $285 million. It won. On the 16th of May, 2001, MTN Nigeria made the first GSM call ever placed on Nigerian soil. The company launched commercially in Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt simultaneously. What happened next is one of the fastest customer acquisition stories in the history of African business. Nigeria in 2001 had a population of 120 million people and fewer than 500,000 working telephones. The country had been waiting 40 years for a working national network. Inside 3 years, MTN Nigeria would have more than 4 million subscribers. Inside 10 years, it would have more than 40 million. The yellow MTN umbrella above a roadside kiosk, selling recharge vouchers by the minute, would become one of the most ubiquitous commercial images of 21st century West Africa. The Nigerian win changed the center of gravity of the company. South Africa was still the headquarters, but Nigeria was, increasingly, the profit pool. In 2002, the same year the company formally renamed itself from MCell to MTN Group, a new chief executive took over. His name was Futhuma Netsleko. He was a civil engineer by training, an Ohio State graduate, an MBA from Atlanta University. He had grown up in KwaZulu-Natal, and he was about to become, by a wide margin, the most consequential executive in MTN's history. Under Netsleko, the company stopped picking off markets one at a time. In 2005, MTN was awarded a second Iranian mobile license over Turkcell, the Turkish operator that had been the original preferred bidder. The reversal would become the longest-running corporate bribery dispute in African business history. Turkcell has alleged ever since that MTN secured the license by improper means. MTN, through an independent committee chaired by the British law lord Leonard Hoffman, has consistently denied wrongdoing. The case is, as of 2026, still in front of the South African courts. We will come back to it. Then, in 2006, Netsleko did something no African telecoms executive had ever done. He spent $5.5 billion in cash to acquire a single Lebanese headquartered operator called Investcom. In one transaction, MTN absorbed Investcom's licenses across Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, Ghana, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Guinea, Liberia, and Cyprus. 10 countries in a single signing. The footprint that had taken MTN 12 years to build organically was now, overnight, more than doubled. By the end of 2006, MTN was operating in 21 countries across Africa and the Middle East. It had more than 50 million subscribers. It was no longer a regional South African operator. It was the largest single mobile network on the African continent. The pivot was complete. The northbound bet had become a continental empire, and the empire was now everywhere, which, as it turned out, was both the answer to MTN's strategy and the source of every problem it would face for the next 20 years. Between 2009 and 2024, two stories ran in parallel inside MTN. One was the quietest of strategic wins, almost an accident. The other was the loudest of strategic crises, fully self-inflicted. Start with the accident. In March of 2009, MTN launched a small mobile money service in Uganda and Rwanda. The idea was simple. Let people send airtime credit to each other from a basic phone, and let kiosk agents convert that credit into cash. It was called Momo, Mobile Money. It was modeled on Safaricom's M-Pesa, launched 2 years earlier in Kenya. Momo was not, in 2009, a serious business. It was a feature, a defensive product, something the regulators liked because it nudged the unbanked into a digital trail. By 2025, Momo had 70 million customers across 16 countries. It processed $163 billion of transaction value in a single year. It was a separate reportable segment with its own profit and loss statement. The accidental fintech had become one of the largest payment networks on the African continent. Now the crisis. Between 2014 and 2015, the Nigerian state, under pressure from the Boko Haram insurgency in the northeast, instructed every mobile operator in the country to disconnect any SIM card not properly registered against a verified national identity. MTN Nigeria missed the deadline. When the NCC audited the network, it found 5.2 million unregistered SIMs still active. On the 26th of October 2015, the NCC announced its fine. $1,000 per unregistered SIM. $5.2 billion in total. 1,040 billion naira. The largest regulatory fine ever levied on a single company anywhere in the world. The market reaction was immediate. MTN's share price fell by a quarter in 2 weeks. In early November, the group's chief executive, Sifiso Dabengwa, resigned. The CEO of MTN Nigeria, Michael Ikpoki, resigned with him. The group's head of corporate affairs followed. Futsuma Naleko, the architect of the Nigeria win 14 years earlier, was pulled back in as executive chairman to negotiate the country's largest corporate crisis personally, including, by his own later count, multiple direct meetings with then-President Muhammadu Buhari. The settlement, when it came in 2016, reduced the fine to 330 billion naira, about $1.7 billion. But it carried a binding condition that would reshape the company forever. MTN Nigeria had to list publicly on the Nigerian Stock Exchange. That listing happened on the 16th of May, 2019, exactly 25 years to the day after MTN's launch in South Africa. MTN Nigeria became, on day one, the second largest listed company on the NGX, behind only Dangote Cement. The settlement had forced the company to do something it had resisted for 15 years. Surrender its Nigerian operating subsidiary to public ownership and public scrutiny. And then, 5 years later, the second blow arrived, and it had nothing to do with regulators at all. In June 2023, the new Nigerian government under Bola Tinubu unified the country's multiple foreign exchange rates and let the naira float. The currency collapsed from 907 to $1 in December of 2023 to 1,535 to $1 a year later. MTN, Nigeria's debts were in US dollars. Its revenues were in naira. The mismatch incinerated the balance sheet. In 2024, MTN Nigeria, the group's single largest profit pool for the better part of 2 decades, reported a 400 billion naira after-tax loss, its worst result ever as a public company. The bill for the strategy that had defined MTN since 2001 had arrived, again in a different form. The man running MTN in 2026 is a Zimbabwean engineer named Ralph Tendai Mupita. He was born in Harare in 1972. He took a civil engineering degree at the University of Cape Town, then an MBA, then a Harvard program for managers. He spent 15 years at Old Mutual, running its emerging markets business. He joined MTN as Group CFO in 2017, and on the 1st of September 2020, he became Group CEO. Mupita inherited a company that had spent the better part of a decade in a defensive crouch. His response has been a strategy he calls Ambition 2030. It rests on 3 platforms. The first is connectivity, defending and growing the mobile broadband core in MTN's 16 African markets. The second is fintech, running Momo as its own platform business with lending, insurance, remittances, and a MasterCard virtual card partnership now built on top of the basic peer-to-peer rails. The third is digital infrastructure, fiber, data centers, and as of February 2026, the proposed $6.2 billion acquisition of the 75% of IHS towers that MTN does not already own. The IHS deal is a strategic reversal. MTN sold most of those towers to IHS more than a decade ago in sale and leaseback deals that turned passive steel into one-off cash. Buying them back is an admission that owning the physical infrastructure under the network is, after all, a moat, not a balance sheet drag. The Middle East exit is almost finished. Syria was formalized at Mobile World Congress in March 2026. Yemen was sold in 2021. Afghanistan in 2024. Only Iran remains, and Iran is what is left of the bill from the strategy that built the company. Mupita has publicly described MTN's 49% stake in MTN Irancell as, in his own words, a frozen asset. U.S. Treasury sanctions prevent the repatriation of capital. There is no authorized counterparty left to sell it to. Meanwhile, the Turkcell bribery case, 20 years old, and refiled in South Africa after the U.S. courts dismissed it on jurisdictional grounds, was, in May 2025, cleared by the Supreme Court of Appeal of South Africa to proceed to full trial on the merits. $4.2 billion. The substantive allegations are now courtroom testable for the first time. And separately, in the United States, 67 Gold Star families are suing MTN under the Anti-Terrorism Act, alleging that MTN Irancell revenues helped finance attacks that killed American service members in Iraq and Afghanistan. That case is in discovery. Reports of a federal grand jury criminal probe surfaced in August of 2025. MTN denies wrongdoing in both cases and points to the 2013 Hoffman report. The bigger question, the one African policy thinkers are arguing about right now, is whether MTN, in finally retreating to a pure Africa-first footing, has earned the right to be the continent's permanent telecoms backbone, or whether the courts of the next 5 years will redraw the boundaries of the empire one more time. Every empire has an origin. MTN's origin is a license award in a republic that did not yet exist, a black empowerment cap table written in the same months as a new constitution, and a young challenger that could not win at home and so went looking for the rest of the continent. The empire it built now connects 307 million people. The question it leaves us with is whether the company that came of age in a frontier era can survive the courts of the era it now lives in. This is Asili Africa. That is the story. And like every story worth telling, this one is still being written. If this episode made you see something differently, share it with someone who needs to hear it. I am Farouk. This is Asili Africa. Every empire has an origin. Now you know this one. So start building, because yours might be tomorrow's origin story. See you on the next one.